We'll just give a few seconds for people to come in and we'll kick off. Okay, let's make a start. Welcome, everyone. I'm Bobby Duffy. I'm Director of the Policy Institute at King's College London, and it's a real pleasure to welcome so many of you to this webinar today. We had 1,200 sign-ups for today, which shows the popularity of Sam's thinking and this book. This event is the latest in our partnership with the Fairness Foundation, part of our Fair Society series. And today's focus is very much on Sam Freedman's best-selling new book, Failed State. I read it over the summer, hugely enjoyed it. It's an incredibly well-informed analysis of how we got into this position and what we can do. And so much of it echoes our work at the Policy Institute, including on how the public have lost confidence in many of our key institutions. So our work on the World Values Survey, for example, which is a study that tracks confidence and lots of other issues in a wide range of institutions since the 1980s across over 100 countries, shows that this isn't a sudden acute crisis of confidence linked to one particular event, but a long-term chronic condition where, for example, confidence in Parliament has halved through a series of steps downwards since 1981. WVS also shows that the UK public are not yet rejecting the idea of democracy, despite what you might hear from some. In fact, support for democracy in principle is at record highs, but it's our perceptions of how our institutions are delivering or not delivering that's seen as the real decline among the public. And now, actually, the UK compares pretty badly internationally when you look across different countries in that institutional confidence. So Sam's analysis is all about that kind of institutional and systems failure and what we can do about it. So we'll start shortly with an outline from Sam of the key themes of the book and the ideas about what we should be doing next. Then we'll have thoughts from our brilliant panel of Polly Curtis, Chief Executive of Demos, Duncan Robinson, who's political editor and budget columnist for The Economist, and Emma Norris, who's Deputy Director at the Institute for Government. After that, we'll open the floor for questions from the audience. Please do submit your questions using the Q&A function, and get them in early is a good tip. And don't forget to vote for the ones that you'd like to hear answered, because I do rely on that. It makes my job really easy because I will just pick the top questions that come through from people. So it's a tight 1 hour session. We will finish at 2 p.m. sharp because people will have to go on to other things. So let's just crack on quickly and over to Sam. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you very much to everyone who's joined, to the panel, to King's and the Fairness Foundation for organising this, although it is somewhat intimidating having your homework marked by a very impressive panel of people in front of hundreds of other people, but I suppose that's what happens when you write a book. So I want to say a little bit about why I wrote it, why I came up with this particular theme, and then give a very brief outline of the core themes. I decided to write this book in 2021, but it was 2022 when I was writing the proposal and trying to get down exactly what I wanted to say. And it was when everything was going wrong all at the same time in the most dramatic ways. We had Boris Johnson's resignation, we had the Liz Truss experiment, and we also had, alongside that, the economy suddenly taking a big turn for the worse with the big sort of inflationary surge, knock-on effects on public services. It looked like 2022 was going to be the worst winter for the NHS in a long time, which it was. So you could see all of these things going wrong at the same time. And there was a lot of sort of stuff about how terrible Liz Truss was and Boris Johnson was. And I wanted to say it to take it back to a more systems lens of sort of why it was getting so hard to run the country. And I was sort of conscious even then that Labour were very likely to win the next election. So it was kind of written almost to an incoming Labour government, knowing that the timing would work for that, to sort of say to them, look, I know you think these guys were all idiots, and that you're smarter and nicer and have better intentions. But you need to understand that you're going to be operating in a state and a system that really works very badly. And just because you think you're more well-intentioned, that isn't going to be enough to get the policy outcomes you want. And you're going to have to engage with these kind of big long-term trends that have made it so much harder to run the country effectively, if you want to be a successful government. So that was very much the kind of thinking. And in the book, I sort of argue there's three big trends that have happened over the last 30, 40 years, each of which has made it harder to govern the country and collectively have sort of combined in a really very toxic fashion. So I'll run through what those three themes are quickly. The first is around centralization. And this is two types of centralization. So the kind of one people are probably most familiar with is the idea of centralizing from local to Whitehall. So the destruction of local government, which was never particularly strong in England, but has been made an awful lot weaker from sort of Thatcher onwards. And the fact that we now have local government that essentially has almost no autonomy over what money it raises, or what money it can spend, and gets the money in a whole load of really complicated little pots that it can't, which sort of again reduce autonomy. And this is very different from most other developed countries. So this story of destruction of local government is one, I argue, of loss of capacity. So in doing that, in taking out local government, and often doing it for what seemed like entirely valid reasons, because local government wasn't doing a particularly good job at running a particular service. And I write about my own experience in the Department of Education doing this with the academy schools and taking oversight away from local authorities. And there was often very good reason for doing this, or felt like it was a very good reason. But collectively, what that's done is completely overwhelm the centre of government and left central government sort of responsible for absolutely everything that happens in the country. And has left them unable to deal with strategic issues, but also unable to deliver effectively because there's no capacity left anywhere to do that delivery. And what that has meant is that central government's become very reliant on big outsourcing firms essentially to do a lot of the delivery that in most countries would be done by local government, with fairly disastrous consequences in lots of cases. And yet those big outsourcing firms are kind of now too big to fail almost, or when they do fail, like Carillion, it has very negative impacts on a lot of systems. So there's that sort of story, which I think is probably fairly familiar, but I think it's probably worse than most people realize. But the other bit of the story is centralization from sort of within Whitehall, from departments to both Number 10 and to the Treasury. And this is quite a complicated story, because I think it sort of starts with the Prime Minister's role becoming much more powerful and it's sort of presidential over many decades. And that sort of culminates in Tony Blair building this machine in Downing Street, which was relatively speaking quite effective. And sort of pulling all of the sort of decisions and sort of press attention towards Number 10. But then when he left and Number 10 became much less effective, as it has been since, it's left this sort of strategic void in Whitehall, which has been filled by the Treasury, which was also has also been getting stronger and stronger over 30, 40 years. Was particularly strengthened by Gordon Brown, who took into the Treasury an awful lot of effective decision-making about what other departments had previously been responsible for, using spending control as a lever for driving decision-making in other departments and taking much more sort of authority into the Treasury. And as Number 10 has sort of collapsed following Blair, that's made the Treasury the sort of locus of control in Whitehall, the only people who ever have a strategy. And their strategy is always whatever the scorecard says, which is, how much money do we need to spend? How much money can we spend next year? And we can't go over that level. So short-term spending control limits have essentially become the only strategic driver of anything that happens. And whilst you do need to obviously pay attention to how much money you're spending, and that is a strategic kind of factor, if it's the only one, you're going to inevitably end up with a very messy, unstrategic way of doing government. So, and we've sort of seen this, I think, in recent years with arguments about the sort of increasingly rigid but arbitrary fiscal rules that seem to be the only thing driving decision-making, as again, we've seen with sort of the row about winter fuel allowance this week. So you've got this sort of double centralization, local to centre, and then within Whitehall from centre to Treasury and Number 10. And that's meant you've just got this tiny number of people who, however smart and brilliant they are, simply cannot make every decision that needs to be made about the country, certainly not in an effective way. And that's sort of a big trend that's part one of why we've got this sort of very difficult to run country now. The second theme is about scrutiny, and we've always had a very powerful executive in this country. Parliament has been relatively weak, but I argue that kind of almost paradoxically, as a result of MPs becoming more professional and more annoying to the executive, the result has been a series of governments that have strengthened that executive power even more and found more and more ways of trying to avoid scrutiny through a variety of measures that I discuss in the book, including a massive increase in secondary legislation, changes to timetabling rules that allow you to kind of ram stuff through the Commons, which has meant the quality of legislation has become a lot poorer because it's not doesn't go through any kind of serious scrutiny process in the Commons. The Lords are getting this kind of half-digested crap that they then have to try and sort into something that could actually be feasible and workable. But also the Lords is also getting less effective because it is now becoming more political and more whipped, although it's still more effective than the Commons. And then kind of as a result of both these things, you're getting the courts much more involved in political decision making because a lot of bad legislation is ending up in the courts through judicial review or other mechanisms. And judges have been quite open that they are being more active in the policy making space because they think Parliament is essentially not doing its job or is getting overpowered by the executive, as with the Brexit cases, the Miller cases during Brexit. So you have this sort of roll-on effect of sort of loss of scrutiny, poor legislation, far more involvement of the courts, which isn't good in a democracy, and again a sort of real weakening of the state, of the effectiveness of the state as a result. And I also have in that section around scrutiny the sort of weakening of another form of scrutiny, which is around the civil service and the way the civil service had previously been much more prepared to give honest and open advice and criticism towards government in private, as is right. And again, the way the executive has dealt with that, again, over successive governments, is to essentially try and cow the civil service by taking more executive power to essentially fire senior civil servants or not reappoint them, and that has led to a sort of loss of that form of scrutiny, of sort of internal scrutiny within government as well, and also a loss of that kind of disempowerment has led to a loss of a lot of the best civil servants from the system too. And again, we've already seen a reflection of that in the new government with a story about sort of defence ministers saying you will have to sign off any spending over £50,000. I mean, what's that saying to civil servants about how much they're trusted? And again, what's that doing to that relationship? So you have all of these sort of forms of kind of soft scrutiny that existed in our system, in which the executive always had a lot of power, that have been diminished by an executive that is increasingly frustrated about its inability to get stuff done, and you get this kind of vicious cycle. And then the final section of the book, just running very quickly, is on the kind of media cycle and the way the media cycle is sped up as a result of 24-hour TV and the internet and social media, both in terms of what's that's done to sort of political decision making and the sort of obsession with controlling that news cycle, or that kind of constant news flow by coming up with constant announcements to make, and so that sort of announcement-driven policy making rather than trying to make policy that actually is going to work. You're trying to manage a media cycle, and comms are sort of eaten policy as a sort of primary sort of aspect of what a lot of departments spend their time doing. But also the way the media industry has changed during that period too, as a result of these changes, and the way that due to the economics of people not buying newspapers anymore, there being less money for newspapers and so on, they've got rid of a lot of their specialist correspondents, and the lobby now report on policy as well as politics. And the lobby are good at politics, they are not good at policy, that they don't have policy specialism. So when they report on policy, and this goes for the broadcasters now as well as the newspapers do this, they report on it as a political story. So it's not, is this going to work, this new education or health policy? It's, what does it say about the person announcing it? Has there been a row in government about it? Might there be a rebellion about it? Or just, we've got an exclusive on this and an announcement. There's never any in-depth reporting of the policy itself, and there's never any follow-up. So all the incentive for government is just to keep announcing stuff without actually ever doing anything in the real world which is what exactly the pattern that we now see. And I sort of talk about things like budgets, where you technically will have 150 announcements collected from all over government in a budget. And that's sort of creating more and more havoc in terms of creating all of this sort of opportunity cost and policy making, all of these sort of new policies that don't go anywhere and take up time and waste time and money. And have no political benefit for anybody, because the public have now completely tuned out of all of this, because they know it never happens in the real world. So it's all become this kind of cargo cult game of the governments have got very good at managing this kind of news cycle, but to no end anymore. And that's very destructive too. So you kind of combine these three trends together. You've got an increasingly centralized government with an increasingly powerful executive that is nevertheless struggling to know what it actually wants to do, and a terrible set of incentives around this new news cycle. And that is why you have this kind of this mess, this inability to make good policy. And it's only when you try and deal with these challenges, and I do have, it's not just me complaining, there are ideas for solutions in this book as well. Only when you start kind of decentralizing, building capacity for delivery outside of outsourcing firms, find ways to encourage scrutiny, basically find ways to push power out in democratic ways, that I think you can start to resolve some of these problems. And if you just if you don't do anything about these problems and say, we're going to try and fix the NHS, we're going to try and fix the schools, etc., you will not be able to implement that policy agenda without engaging with these negative trends. I will stop there because I'm interested in what everyone else has to say.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sam. Excellent overview. Just going to hand over to Polly in a sec. Just do have a think about the questions that you would like to ask, or look at the questions that people are coming up with. Great things coming through already. But Polly, let's get your thoughts.
Thanks so much, Bobby, and thank you, Sam, for that. It's such a delight to be here to celebrate Sam's new book. Sam, I think it's nearly 20 years since I started calling you up as a policy reporter at The Guardian, and you were a young think tanker. And you were probably the only young think tanker I was calling constantly then, because you always knew what you were talking about. I always trusted what you said, and you always had an interesting take on what you would tell me. So and I think all of those three things are absolutely reflected in this brilliant new book. It's knowledgeable, it's trustworthy, and it's interesting. It's a different take on what's going on. So I struggle to find things to disagree with, but I've done my job and I have. So the thing I think I would say about kind of the central thesis, which is that broken institutions, not individuals, are causing the failure of the state, is absolutely demonstrably true. And I think all the evidence Sam has collated here points towards that. And I think one of the biggest outcomes of that is a loss of confidence, both by the people in the state, but also by people within the state. I think what you hear from politicians, what you see in the behaviours, is a real lack of confidence that the state can make a difference at the moment. And you saw that in the last government that did relatively little, particularly in recent years. And I think there are signs in the new government that it's finding it hard to do things differently, and to, as Sam puts it, kind of challenge the orthodoxy. So it's a really timely focus on failed institutions rather than individuals. And I think Sam's call to arms about challenging that orthodoxy of how things don't work is absolutely vital. It doesn't have to be this way, but it will be this way if you don't do something about it. But at Demos, we're interested in kind of another angle on this, which is where the state meets citizens and the notion of the demos of people within a state. So you would expect us to take a slightly different perspective on this, which is that institutions and people are irrevocably linked and part of the same system. And the thing that we think is going wrong is at the intersection between policy, governance, and people. And that's both the people within the political system, so not only the Boris Johnsons and the Liz Trusses, but any policymaker at every level, really. So the intersection between the people within the political system and those institutions, but then also the intersection between the wider public and the political system. And so while it is absolutely right that the institutions are going wrong and the system is going wrong, there is also a kind of cultural problem that's driving that. And these are all kind of part of the same problem, I think. And those three areas of Sam's kind of analysis on centralization, scrutiny, and the role of the media are all really about kind of perverse incentives between institutions and the people within them. And those are the things that need shifting. So you can't just change an institution. It's about cultural reform and creating different incentives for behaviors as well. It's fundamentally a kind of systems problem of behaviors and institutions that's creating that lack of confidence by those within the state that it can make things better. But then there's also that gap between systems and the citizens that it serves, and the dire state of kind of trust in the political system. And that is also contributing to this lack of confidence in what can be done. If the state and politicians and policymakers don't feel trusted to make decisions, particularly the kind of really tough decisions that we'll have to make in the years to come, it will be inhibited in its policy making, and it will have that orthodoxy about it that says we can't make change happen. So my challenge would be, apart from agreeing with everything in it, is that it's not just about the institutions and isolations. It's not just about the governance, and it's not just about the people, but it's about how these things are coming together to create the wrong incentives, drive the wrong behaviours, and really undermining everyone's confidence in the state's ability to do things better. And at Demos, a lot of our ideas are focusing on one element of improving that, which is about creating a different way of making policy, a more participative and deliberative form of policy making, in order to improve policy, but also to rebuild trust between state and citizens. And it's not about giving power away, but actually partnering with the public to empower the political system to make the difficult decisions better. So apart from agreeing with everything in the book, the analysis, and really enjoying the read, I would just add that the complexity about how people and institutions come together, create bad incentives, also needs addressing. And if you don't address that, the change won't happen, and we won't rebuild the confidence that needs to be rebuilt to deliver the change that we need to make.
Awesome. That's amazing. Thank you so much, Polly. Sam, I'm going to get all the panelist contributions, but then come back to you after those just to get any reflections from you. So, Duncan, would you like to go next?
Hi there. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed the book, and like Polly, there's not much in it that I disagree with. One of my favourite quotes from the book was just from the anonymous SPAD, who just made the point that government doesn't really do anything. It's procurement agency that isn't very good at procurement, which is a quote that I just thought really summed it up, because we've sort of developed, the state sort of developed into this checkbook state, that all it can do is just sort of give people money, and then beyond that it sort of shrugs. And so I was reading Sam's book at the same time that I was reading another book by a man called Dan Davies called The Unaccountability Machine, and he talks about accountability sinks, just where sometimes they're very good, like central banking. You probably don't want monetary policy under the sort of thumb of politicians, but we're now just doing it in increasing areas where, you know, the government simply doesn't have control of the levers anymore. So I would recommend that book to anyone who's really enjoyed Sam's book, because I think they sort of complement each other very well. So I think Sam's diagnosis of the flaws was extremely eloquent and clear. So in terms of the solutions, and again, I broadly agree with him. So Sam makes a big deal of devolution. He thinks devolution is the way of sort of deloading our overloaded central governments. And I broadly agree, but what I think Sam underplays is just sort of how messy devolution inherently is. So devolution means winners and losers. It means sort of postcode lotteries. I just did a sort of Google Ngram search for the term postcode lottery. You saw this huge spike in the Labour years, and it just sort of disappeared as an issue. That's just because problems have sort of moved up to a national level. Everyone's really worried about the NHS. No one's sort of really complaining about the bins anymore, because they're worried that if their mother has a heart attack, you know, the ambulance won't come. So it sort of pops down. But if you have a functioning state, And if devolution does fix things a little bit, it will be messy, it will be a little unpopular. And you do sort of have to remember why we ended up with such a centralized, say, state in the first place. And that's partly because people sort of wanted it. You have to basically force people to accept devolution deals. They're instinctively very skeptical of it. So I'm a big fan of a guy called Tom Forth. I'm sure lots of people watching this follow him. He's very big on devolution, but he's very honest about it. He appreciates that, you know, it does mean that London will probably become a little bit more prosperous than it already is. But his argument is that other cities will sort of catch up, but it will just be messy. And he occasionally does these polls where on things like sort of bin apps, he sort of asks people, should there be a national bin app? And all of the sort of nerds who follow them say, yes, of course, there should be a national bin app, there should be gov.uk, we should have bin.uk as well. And Tom sort of points out how sort of ridiculous that is. So for all that people like us sitting in rooms like this nod very solemnly about how devolution is a very, very good idea, I think we do sort of forget just how sort of messy it can be. Now, Sam does mention that, but I think it's just a little bit underplayed. The other point is on the quality of legislation, which again, it is just worse. We did a piece about a year ago making the point that there's just more errors. Parliament's sort of sitting less. It's less good. If you speak to anyone in the House of Lords, they've known for years about having to basically do the Commons' job for them, which is just, it's sort of what it's there for, but it's just it's a little bit unhealthy to have the unelected parts of the system doing quite fundamental parts of legislation. And again, exactly the same problem when judges come in. You do not want so many lacunas in your legislation that sort of judges have to fill them. But I do wonder if that is quite a sort of technical or technocratic solution to what is fundamentally a political problem. So if you think about the big problems we have, like we just haven't built enough prisons in the past decade or so. We've actively sort of closed prisons in the Conservative years. But they were sort of political decisions that were made. And this, when you look at HS2, like the government chose to build it in a stupid, expensive way. Like we could just have a sort of better, probably more fairer tax system, but governments are basically, they're bluntly politically scared to. So I wonder if the sort of technical problems with legislation become a sort of cul-de-sac, or just that it's not going to solve the bigger political issues. So that was why at the end I was a little bit surprised when Sam doesn't really discuss electoral reform as a potential solution to these problems, because at the moment I think we're sort of sleptwalked into the situation where we have basically sort of proportional representation voting. If you hit the vote share button, it's basically the same as any other sort of PR country. Generic centre-left party gets 30-something, and then generic centre-right party gets 20-something, and mad populists get 20, and then wet centrists get 12. That's just the same, but we have a first-past-the-post system which generates this insane results. And I think people, if there's another sort of election like this one, people will start thinking that is very peculiar and not very representative, and I think that's dangerous. So again, I think electoral reform is something that should be considered by people looking at why Britain has failed the past few years. In terms of Sam's critique of journalism, it's broadly spot on, and we completely agree on sort of the upside down nature of criticism of lobby journalists, because a lot of people said the lobby should be focused far more on policy, and no, it's like, no, that is the last thing the lobby should be doing. Like, we do just need more specialist journalists doing specialist reporting, and that is the problem. But I will do a little bit of depends sort of horse race style journalism and politics, because politics is political. And so we will see that with this Labour administration. If Labour is crawling along in the polls at 24 in 2 years' time, it's not going to have much of a policy agenda, because you're just going to have a load of senior cabinet ministers lining up to try and kill Keir Starmer. So like they are linked. You do, but so the problem is that the problem with the lobby is that it sort of gets bogged down in these policy stories, that it doesn't do its fundamental job, which is reporting the politics of it, which sometimes means the personality of it, and so that can become a little bit of a distraction. But on the whole, I thought it was a really fantastic, very powerful diagnosis of everything that's wrong, and a perfect climate of exactly how screwed we are.
Great ending, Duncan. That's very concise. So Sam, again, we'll come back to you. Just hold those in your head. Emma, great to hear from you as well.
Thanks, Bobby. And like everyone else, just want to say fantastic work to Sam. I very much annoyed my wife by insisting on spending our drive to France listening to a governance book on audio. So she thanks you for that. Look, I mean, I essentially agreed with almost everything in the book. One of the insights that landed most with me and speaks most to what I've seen and worked on at the Institute for Government is the sense of being stuck in a cycle to some extent of kind of superficiality and short-termism, particularly when so many of the political incentives and therefore the incentives that inform officials and the wider system have been focused on the short term, whether that's a need to feed the media cycle or to prove yourself before you're reshuffled onto the next role, or to prove yourself indeed so you can get a better role in the bureaucracy. I think that has been, heightened after a series of crises that genuinely did require intensive short-term reactive work. But it means that we not only have quite powerful short-term incentives, but a system with lots of people who thrived in the kind of policy work that you do in a crisis rather than when you're planning for the long term. I think another point that comes through quite strongly in Sam's analysis that really spoke to me is a sense of layering, that this isn't just about failures in central government, but about a series of connected weaknesses across a range of different institutions, parliament, government, both national, regional and local, the media. So I think, the analysis is really compelling in the interrelated nature of the crisis, but it makes getting out of it that much harder. There were just a kind of couple of points that I suppose I wanted to kind of build on in Sam's analysis. I think Sam's right, and this is something that we've argued in our work in the Centre Commission, that the UK is a very highly centralised country, but actually that executive power is focused on the wrong things. And that if you go right to the centre, number 10 is very compulsively involved in detail, but it's actually quite underpowered when it comes to providing strategic leadership. And you can see that reflected in the role of Prime Minister, where in some ways power and influence have grown. So it wasn't that long ago that even in priority policy areas, they were considered the near exclusive domain of Secretaries of State, to the extent that if a question was asked about one of those areas in PMQs, the Prime Minister would give way to the relevant Secretary of State. It's very hard to imagine that happening now. So in some ways, kind of power and reach of the Prime Minister has increased. On the other hand, the kind of strategy, the top priorities that are driving government, actually it can be really difficult for a Prime Minister to see money, time, resource actually matched to those big headline priorities. So you have a weird mismatch of, in some ways, kind of quite powerful executives, but on the other hand, kind of absence or weakness of strategy. I think there's another point that I wanted to touch on, and this speaks, a little bit to what you've talked about, Polly. At one point in the book, Sam, you say people matter, but systems matters more. And as the deputy director of the Institute for Government, I'm definitely not going to argue that systems don't matter. I think they do matter, and I think that they're really important. But I think there is value in thinking about how we improve government through the lens of people. And I think one of the group of people that it is worth focusing on, and that we think quite a lot about at IFG, is ministers. Ministers, who they are and what they're motivated by matters a lot. And some of the moments when we have achieved reform or change tend to combine all sorts of factors, but often do involve leaders who have been willing to take a risk, to make the case to stick with something when lots of the incentives point in the opposite direction, whether that's delivering big projects successfully like the Olympics, or successful educational reform, as happened with London schools in the noughties, or big social change like civil partnerships and same-sex marriage. That does involve people taking risks and being bold. And that's often in spite of the systems and the incentives they're having to work with. So I think there are really important questions about how you make that kind of ministerial behaviour the norm. Partly that's about what we reward, encouraging people to stick with things, to see things through, rather than just being focused on announcements. I think it's also about rewarding the right kinds of behaviour, so perhaps a greater focus on building relationships, creating the foundations for change, taking the time to make good decisions, rather than merely focusing on announcements and speed. I think there's also something about spending more time in supporting ministers to be effective in the role. And I say this, having just seen the country go through a transition of government, it really is astonishing that we expect people to walk into roles with so much responsibility, and yet with so little support in place to help them adapt to that role and do it effectively. And so I think there is much more that we could do there on the kind of through the people lens. I think another point is about putting power in the hands of the right people. And Sam, you talk a lot about devolution in your book. That's something we talked a lot about at IFG too. And just as with local and regional decision makers often being better placed to decide, for instance, beneath the kind of headline goal of growth, how you actually make that happen in a local area, I think so too are public servants better placed to make decisions about how to improve service delivery or support cohesion. Dan Honig's recently written a really interesting book on mission-driven bureaucrats and how we are pervaded by a culture of compliance in the public sector that overemphasizes having individuals follow rules and underdoes supporting people who are working in the public sector to use their expertise and judgment to make good decisions. So I think another really important part of making progress beyond some of the challenges that Sam describes, and indeed delivering missions, is going to be moving away from so much central control and prescription, and instead towards having a shared sense of goals, but giving lots of different people kind of trust in delivering those. And then the final people point I wanted to make was just about the proximity between those with power and the people whose lives that power affects. And I think often when we talk about Whitehall, we talk about expertise. That's something that we focus a lot on at IFG. And it's absolutely right that we need to make sure the system welcomes people with specialisms, that there's a greater porosity between government and other sectors, that we reward people fairly and move away from a kind of overemphasis on policy and private office experience in the civil service, and towards a greater kind of respect for and emphasis on individual expertise, delivery experience, and so on. But I think we could also emphasise more the importance of having civil servants and decision makers who are closer to people's lives, a more humble form of policy making that involves spending more time out of Whitehall and opening the doors of government a little more widely to the voices of people that you're there on behalf of. So I'm going to stop there so there's time for discussion and questions. But yeah, kind of top line is I think it's a brilliant piece of work and thoroughly agree with all of it.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Emma. Before we do go to audience questions, we do have another look at the question set. We're getting some very clear favourite questions come through. I'm going to come back to Sam, and I think the themes there, there's some deep connections between different people's different panelists' points, but Polly's around incentives and the deep interlinks between individuals and institutions in a more systemic way, relating to Emma's points about people and proximity, as well as allowing risk and boldness. Just as an aside, we'll put a link into the chat for a paper that Jonathan Slater wrote for us on exactly that point about proximity and getting central government closer to people's lives, civil service and central government closer to people's lives. And then Duncan's points about devolution, messiness, and the innate political nature of the system, and how do you actually make those distinctions between policy and politics in this type of system. But you'll have your own thoughts, Sam, about what to pick out. Great.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Really good thoughts. I'll try to be quick because I want to make sure we've got time for audience questions. A few things I wanted to pick up on. The point about the messiness of devolution, I do think this is really important. I did try and sort of say devolution is not in any way a utopian model of running government. If you do devolution, you will get failure. You've already seen with the mayors, some of them have been more successful than others. Obviously, the way you do devolution can maximize or minimize the amount of failure, but you're always going to get some. My argument is less that running things at a local or regional level will always work, and more that what we have at the moment cannot work, because by definition, if everything is being decided at the center, it will always be overwhelmed and you will never be able to get strategic decision making. And we have postcode lotteries, right? Anyway, like, if you look at when I did a piece of work on NHS productivity last year, the difference between trust is absolutely vast in different parts of the country. We already have those differences. I would argue you're going to get less difference if you devolve, but certainly what we're doing at the moment isn't working. So even though that absolutely will be messy, and there will be failure, it's still a necessary thing to do. On electoral reform, I was initially going to have a chapter about it in there. But then whilst I absolutely agree with electoral reform, and I think as completely, as Duncan says, we're kind of moving sort of by accident towards it in a very typically British way, where we're sort of voting now in a proportional representation way, still within a first past the post system, and it will kind of break at some point if it hasn't already. So I do think we need to move to that system. I just couldn't figure out how doing that would lead us to have better parliamentarians. Like the people coming in won't necessarily be better than the people we have. It'll be a fairer distribution according to what the public think, but it won't necessarily be better people. And I kind of thought, if you put them into the parliament that we have, you're going to get exactly the same set of problems, which is, that they're coming in as either as constituency MPs or as people who want to be ministers. They're not coming in as people who want to be in a legislature scrutinizing legislation. And until you kind of fix that problem, it kind of doesn't really matter what system you have, even if it was fairer from a democratic point of view. So that's kind of that. And then there's a point that both Emma and Polly talked about sort of people. And I do think people matter. Clearly, there is no system on earth you could create in which Liz Truss would be a good prime minister, right? Like that just isn't possible. So people, of course, people matter. And I think it's sort of really interesting points of are there things you can do to get better people, both to come into the system in the first place and then to sort of learn when they're in there. And we are very bad at that, both in the civil service. And the civil service training I've done some, it's terrible. I think very pro forma and very little money spent on it. And the IFG, I think, are pretty much the only people trying to do anything for ministers. And you do get, one of the things I sort of talk a bit about in the first chapter of the book is this weird sense in which every government sort of relearns the same set of challenges, and prime ministers sort of come in and they're always surprised how nothing in number 10 works. And they always go through the same, wait a minute, the Treasury can do everything and I can't do anything. Maybe we should have some of the Treasury in number 10. But by that point, it's always too late, because their Chancellor, they can never fire their Chancellor by that point. And their Chancellor always has too much power. So you get these kind of cycles because of a lack of learning. So there's definitely things you could do around that. I actually don't think the quality of people coming into the system is actually that bad. I certainly think it's better than it has been in the past. On average, we might not get the superstars we might have had in the past, but your average MP is harder working, smarter, more engaged than was the case 30, 40 years ago. I really do think that you've just got a system in which what they can actually do with that intelligence and ability is incredibly limited. Lots more things I'd like to say, but I'm gonna hand back to you, Bobby, so we can have some questions.
Yeah, great. And I think the first one, the most popular question, is a great segue into expanding on some of your ideas, but also great to hear from the panel on this too. So it's a very direct question about what should the government's top 3 priorities be to go some way to fixing the failed state. So we start with you, Sam, but great to hear from others too.
Yeah, so number one is as we've been talking about, devolution, and I talk quite a bit in the book about mayors as being the kind of easiest way of doing this, because we've already got an infrastructure now. We've got political backing for the kind of role of the mayor. I have just finished writing a quite techie paper, which is almost an appendix to that section of the book, which I'm hoping will be published in a couple of weeks, on exactly how you could do that and build up the role of the mayor, particularly with regards to public services as opposed to the economy. And I will write about that on my Substack as well. Did I mention I have a Substack? I have a Substack. It's called Comment is Freed. You can sign up to that. So I'm gonna set out more. I mean, there's a limit to how much techie stuff you can get into in a book like this, but there's a lot more detail will be in that paper as to how I think we could move to a much stronger mayoral system and use that as the kind of lever for building capacity and devolving power out of Whitehall. I think we need to come up with a sensible, so that's one. Number two, I think we need to come up with a sensible approach to outsourcing. Our approach to outsourcing is a complete disaster at the moment, and generally the use of the private sector to run public services. I mean, the bit on the book that made me angriest to write was about children's homes and the way that private equity is sort of just making an enormous profit out of running children's homes incredibly badly, and it's just a disgrace that that's happening in a 21st century developed country. But even sort of this the more basic kind of standard model of we're going to do something, want to deliver something, let's get Serco to do it, let's get Capita to do it, just doesn't work. And we need, there's not to say that outsourcing can never work. There will be situations in which it's the right approach, absolutely, where you've got a real market, where you can transfer some risk, where government doesn't have the capacity and can't easily build the capacity. there will be arguments for it, but we just use it automatically. And it's been responsible for some of the biggest policy disasters of the last decade, like probation, the probation system, which I discuss in the book, and lots of other examples. So that would be, you know, having a coherent approach to outsourcing and bringing a lot more stuff in-house as you build kind of regional and local capacity would be my second one. And then my third one would be turning the role of the MP into the role, you know, being a member of a legislature part, like the most high status thing an MP can be, which it is in most countries. Like, if you build up local democracy, then being a constituency MP and sort of being a caseworker for your constituency becomes less important. And if you give more status and power to MPs in a legislative role, whether that's being on select committees or giving them more control over timetabling in Parliament, the ability to bring debates, etc., the ability to debate amendments that they believe are important on government legislation, even if the government doesn't want to give time for those debates to be heard, and you build up that role of the MP, I think that would be very, very powerful in creating a system in which government had to pay far more attention to what it was putting in front of the Commons, and would have to that would lead to better legislation, and therefore would help the Lords. It would mean less policy making being decided in the court. So those would be my top three. There are other things in the book, but they're my top three.
Excellent. Really helpful. And let's get panelists' thought on this too. Polly, first, reflections on that or your own thoughts on what we should do?
So a build on that, really. So I absolutely agree on the devolution point. I think that's really fundamental, and I think we need to be able to tolerate a bit of messiness in that. Like it's an essential part of letting go and the country finding the solutions that we need. I think kind of so to build on all the things that Sam has said, kind of, and slightly kind of doubling down on kind of my earlier point. Every kind of transformation program I've been through in the private sector, in actually kind of navigating change in the news industry, prompted by a lot of the things that Sam has written about, you change the structures and the departments and the governance and the ways of working, and then the thing that makes it succeed or fail is the culture that you build around that. And it's much harder for policymakers to think about changing the culture point, but there's got to be a kind of really concerted drive on that in tandem with the kind of the structural and governance changes. So the two things that I would talk about within culture changes, change it, who is in politics. So absolutely fundamentally clarifying, as Sam said, the role of MPs. But MPs need to look and feel more like the country we're in to be able to do the form of humble policy making that Emma talked about as well. And then really changing the way policy is made through participatory and deliberative processes. We need more trust between citizens and the centre to navigate these big problems, to understand the challenges ahead and to come up with the best solutions, but also to build consensus around the solutions ahead. And that idea of humble policy making, a kind of originally a Demos idea under my predecessor, Polly Mackenzie, is really central to that. We need policymakers who are open to listening and building coalitions to deliver missions that ladder from people to civil society to business to the political class around them.
Thanks, Polly. Really good. Duncan, anything to add?
I think the big one that hasn't been mentioned yet is I just think the state needs more money. I think Labour need to put up, if they want a better state, they should need to put up taxes by a lot. My back of the fag packet number was anything like 50 and 80 billion quid. That sounds completely unimaginable, but my general take on tax is that politicians vastly overestimate how much people care about and notice tax rises. My best example of that is George Osborne is not remembered particularly fondly by people, but that's because of spending cuts. It's not because of VAT by 2.5%. You can get away with a lot more tax rises than people think, and the political cost is roughly the same, whether you're raising 4 billion or whether you're raising 40 billion. I fundamentally don't think there's that much difference in people's minds between it. And the flip side of that is the Tories in the last election with loads of tax cuts. Did anyone notice? No. Did anyone care? Not really. The other part would be once you raise that money, spend it in places where it would be departments where it would be utterly transformational. So 10 billion quid in the NHS is just going to evaporate. It's not actually going to result in people feeling the difference. Whereas 10 billion quid into local government would be gigantic. If you offered sort of local council chief executives choice between more powers and more money, my hunch is that they would choose more money every single time at the moment. So I think that's the option. And the third one is slightly more quixotic. I'm a big fan of thousands bad theory. I think ministers should have a little bit more political control over the system. I think that I don't think it's a coincidence Michael Gove was one of the most effective ministers in last government, and he was very good at sort of slotting people into these sort of semi-bad roles and having his own people in positions of power, and I think that did make him much more effective. And when you see people flailing in ministerial roles, it's often because they're not quite up to it, but giving them more political help, I think, would help them a lot.
Right, very clear, very interesting. Thanks, Duncan. And Emma.
Going last, I mean, all the good points have been taken.
Yes, I'll change the order.
I think, you know, if there's one thing that stands out for me, it's absolutely devolution. I think that the only way that we start to get out of this is to ensure that power is in the right places. And I think actually that does mean some quite difficult political choices for central government. If we're serious about, for instance, attempting to complete the map of regional devolution, either in this parliament or shortly after, then there are real choices to be made about whether you are attempting to go for the most transformational deals at a regional level, which might have to be to some extent imposed by central government, or whether you were going to do something slightly more incremental. But I think either way, you need to make significant progress on devolution to get out of some of this mess. I think probably one of the things that hasn't been said is a bit more about the role of central government. I think there's a real opportunity on the back of missions after so many years of instability, of constant changing priorities, which has created all sorts of challenges, not just for central government, regional government and local government, but also for industry, for civil society. There's a real opportunity here to set some priorities, to actually run a spending review over multiple years, which delivers money to those priorities and creates a sense of certainty for government and for beyond government to actually start taking action and to have that assurance that those priorities are going to stick. That is what people are going to be rewarded for. That is what we're aiming at. And so I think there's a really important kind of opportunity over the next 6 months for government to do that, to be really clear about what it is trying to achieve and what it wants to work with others to achieve, and to actually attempt to build government around that rather than to allow a more piecemeal and unstable approach.
Great. Really important. Thank you, Emma. So I'm going to, since we're running out of time, I'm going to put 2 questions to you. You can kind of pick which ones to focus on. I'll cover both quickly. And I will go in reverse order so we can finish with Sam. So it's these are the other 2 top questions. What do you think could be done to increase the use of evidence, e.g. from impact evaluations in spending and operational decisions in government, which is, that's our audience, very much focused on that evidence point. And then what changes can be made to parliamentary procedure to improve scrutiny of legislation, particularly of delegated legislation? Do you have any hope that the Modernisation Committee will improve parliamentary scrutiny of legislation? So we can take both of those and you can pick either or cover each quickly. And maybe start with you, Emma, then, if that's okay.
Sure, I will take Parliament because I completely agree with Sam that this is another one of the ways to try and make progress out of some of this mess. There are a couple of things that I would do on Parliament. I think, first of all, on delegated legislation, just use less of it. There should be a kind of straightforward commitment to do that, scale back the use of delegated legislation for really significant policy change. I think we need to really increase Parliament's kind of scrutiny capacity. And so let's actually take the time to scrutinise primary legislation properly. Let's see an end to really important bits of legislation being rushed through and instead allow Parliament to do its job. I think, the government's kind of grip on the timetable of the House of Commons is really unusual in international terms. It caused big problems with Brexit during the pandemic. So I think another key change that could be made is giving the Commons some more power over the parliamentary timetable itself, slightly redressing the balance of power between government and the House. And so I think there are a whole range of changes that you could make to Parliament that would enable it to play a far more effective role on the scrutiny side. And of course, there are select committees themselves. And I think exactly as Sam has said, attempting to make the role of parliamentarians, particularly in some of the kind of key roles that you can take on in Parliament, as attractive in a career path as going into government is a really, important opportunity for us.
Right. Brilliant. Thank you, Emma. And Duncan, on either evidence or Parliament?
So on the making policy more sort of evidence-based and thoughtful, like I feel like the answer to that is incredibly broad, in so that you just need to sort of follow the things that Sam laid out in the book. Like there's so many different factors to it, things like sort of dominance of the Treasury, just sort of using everything to numbers, and the fact that it just sort of infantilizes departments to such a degree that they can't really think about it. So like what sounds like quite a small questions, like make departments sort of fill in a few more questionnaires, whatever. I think it only has sort of gigantic solutions, are the ones that sort of Sam advocates. And in terms of just improving scrutiny legislation, to give better staff for MPs. Like at the moment, if you work for an MP, you get paid a very small salary. You do it for 3 years, and you're 23, and you spend all day answering emails from very young constituents. That's not ideal for high quality scrutiny legislation.
Right. Thank you, Duncan. And Polly.
So on the evidence point, I kind of feel like we're at a really confused point on evidence-based policy making, because I think, every engagement I have with the government department, the first question is, what's the evidence? Like, that is very much kind of drilled into the process. But it also inhibits kind of innovation as well, because if you're completely tied to the evidence, what's the evidence for something that's never been done before? So I think like rationales, having really good rationales for trying things. But I think at the moment, evidence can be put up as a blocker for change as well. And so there is a limit to that. And also what constitutes evidence, because evidence might be proof that a programme works, or it could be a public engagement program that shows there is appetite and people are up for that kind of change. So thinking differently about what evidence is, and getting the line between being very technocratic and then being very partisan, kind of weaving a way through that gets to a better result. And just building on what's been said about MPs, we absolutely have to clarify the role of MPs and staff them properly, so that they can either connect better in their constituency or legislate better in Parliament. But at the moment, they're doing both not well enough, and it's a really, really hard job.
Thank you, Polly. And finally, Sam, reflections on those or anything else, just to wrap up.
So I think on use of evidence, I think part of the problem is departments they talk about it in this kind of very pro forma way, but they're not actually incentivized to find out the evidence, because that's not what they're being asked to do by ministers. They're being asked to implement policy solutions that the ministers want to do. And then there's a quote from David Lidington, who's effective deputy prime minister, in the book, where he says when he was a sort of SPAD in the Home Office in the 1990s, when it was responsible for justice, they had this sort of quite big team who were compiling evidence from sort of all over the world on what the most effective criminal justice systems were doing. And then when he became Justice Minister in the May government, he went in and there was none of that. It was just because they're not funded, they're not incentivized, they're not asked to do that. So you sort of have this kind of, they know they're supposed to ask the question, but there's no expertise within departments actually doing it. Some are worse than others. So I think you have to be seriously want to use it, and the only way you're going to want to use it is if you're incentivized to do the right thing, which goes to all the other points that I've been making on parliamentary procedure. I mean, I don't have much to add to what Emma said. A lot of what I say in the book is obviously comes from the work the Institute for Government have done. The only thing I would add is, of all the things in the book, it's the one I'm least positive that Labour are actually going to do anything on, certainly on the basis of their initial legislation, which does, you know, they've introduced bills that are terrible skeleton bill kind of structures. They've used secondary legislation to do the winter fuel allowance already. Like, they seem to be using all the same tricks. I would love to think that they were going to respond to this and change in their own interests, but I fear they're much more interested in, they are genuinely interested in decentralization, devolution, and some of the other bits of the book, but this one feels we're a long way off people getting why it matters.
Great. Thank you, Sam. And does show how important this is going to be as a continuing discussion. This is going to be in for the long haul. We have to, though, stop there. So before I give thanks to all the people involved, I just wanted to flag that we've got another brilliant event with the Fairness Foundation coming up just next week, actually, on Danny Dorling's new book, 7 Children on Intergenerational Inequality, which I'm reading now. Is a great book. It's at 17th of September. I think the link's just gone in. So only left for me to say thank you to Fairness Foundation and Will Snell for this partnership and great series of events, to the team at the Policy Institute for putting it all together, particularly Sophia. Thank all of you for coming, our excellent panel, and of course, finally, Sam for his great book. Thank you. Thank you all.